everyone, my name is Rhys Koszczynski. This is Simple Philosophy, where we simplify philosophers to help you better understand life. In today's episode, we're going to be taking another look at our series on Plato.
Socrates. Now what? I don't know. Philosophize with.
Now, in today's episode, I'm again going to be joined by Sean Ledwith, who's going to be taking us through the death of Socrates and its influence on Plato, some basics of Socrates' philosophy, and then some basics of Plato's early philosophy too. If you enjoy the video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Timestamps are available down below in the description, and without further ado, let's get into it.
So I guess we best move on to probably one of the most influential events for Plato, at least in his developments. I think you probably agree with, which is the death of Socrates. I don't know if you want to go into the background of the death of Socrates, because it's quite a compelling story.
Yeah, so Socrates is really probably the one philosopher that people have heard about who never studied philosophy and maybe got no interest in it. So Socrates is sort of ubiquitous as the great philosopher and the great thinking man. And again, we have to situate Socrates in the context of this political turbulence of the 5th century. So Socrates was born in about 470. He was the son of a midwife and a stonemason, according to the tradition. And Socrates became famous for wandering the city of Athens and asking people really awkward questions like, what is truth, what is beauty, what is justice, and make you think. And that sounds like a wonderful thing, and undoubtedly it was. But at the same time, Socrates was again associated with these enemies of democracy. So we have people like Critias, Alcibiades, Charmides. These were students of Plato who essentially led the aristocratic reaction against the democracy. So now Socrates was a loyal servant of the democracy. He fought for the democracy in the Peloponnesian War. He refused to carry out the orders of the 30 tyrants. So again, I think it's simplistic to regard Socrates as entirely a figure of the right. But I think now his trial, of course, we have the sort of famous image by the French painter Jacques-Louis David. Plato is regarded as a martyr of democracy. But Plato was executed by the democracy, essentially because the democratic leaders regarded him as essentially a spokesperson for the sort of the oligarchic reaction for the pro-Spartan regime. And to some extent, I think that is a justified view, because Socrates taught some of the most influential leaders of the anti-democratic faction. So the trial and execution of Socrates again has to be situated in the context of this essentially class struggle within Athens between the traditional landowning aristocracy versus the new sort of urban mercantile elite. For example, so Socrates was put on trial essentially with sort of 3 allegations. One is blasphemy against the traditional gods. Secondly, introducing new gods. And thirdly, corrupting the youth. The accusation that he was corrupting with the youth was specifically this allegation that he was responsible for leaders like Alcibiades and Critias, who had essentially undermined and tried to overthrow the democracy. So Socrates was scapegoated, and after his execution, the Athenian democracy did publicly regret the execution of Socrates. But in some ways, I think we have to understand why the accusations against him were not entirely unfounded. And that this sort of eulogizing Socrates as a martyr to liberal democracy, again, is a simplistic one, because in many ways he was on the wrong side in this sort of class struggle in ancient Athens. Now, of course, Plato was the greatest student of Socrates, and Socrates was a massive influence on Plato. And Plato's early dialogues are essentially articulating the views that Socrates probably had. So Socrates never writes anything down, like a lot of other sort of really great thinkers like Buddha and Jesus, never writes anything down, and yet his views are written down by later thinkers and shape Western philosophy right up to the present time.
Socrates, there he is, Socrates.
So let's get into a bit of Socrates then, because I think you kind of raised initially here the question of authorship, because there is a bit of a blurring of the line between Socrates and Plato in terms of who said what and what has been reinterpreted.
That's right, and to some extent, this debate doesn't matter. To some extent, it's a rather sort of scholastic argument about where does Socrates end and Plato begin. But it does matter in the sense that Socrates essentially, in the dialogues, ends up as a critic of democracy, as arguing essentially for a sort of intellectual aristocracy. So Plato might be doing Socrates a disservice there. So to that extent, it does matter. You might take the viewpoint that Plato was distorting the views of Socrates. But like I say, in a sort of philosophical sense, it doesn't really that too much. I mean, they clearly were very close intellectually, emotionally, and philosophically. And Plato regards himself as the intellectual heir of Socrates, and I think for the sake of argument, we should accept that. Now, in terms of the pre-Socratics we talked about earlier, they were interested in questions of ontology and metaphysics. In other words, what is there, or what is the world made of? Those sort of questions, in many ways, modern physics has now taken over. Socrates, his significance is he turns the focus of philosophy back onto what we might call ethics and politics. In other words, how should you run a just society? How should a just person act? How should we interact with each other? So in philosophical terms, that is the importance of Socrates, this turn onto the questions of politics and ethics. The peripatetic style, again, is this famous mode of learning that Socrates had. So he'd wander the city, usually followed by a sort of entourage. This entourage is essentially made up of young aristocrats who would follow Socrates around as he was asking people these awkward questions. And part of this was the dialectical method. So asking people awkward questions. Of course, Socrates famously had this sort of veneer of ignorance. He claimed to know nothing. And the oracle famously said that Socrates is the wisest man because he knows nothing. So he had this sort of this humble veneer, but clearly beneath it, he was an incredibly thoughtful and original and dynamic thinker. And the dialectical method of two people engaging in a debate, and between them, through thesis and antithesis, coming up with a new viewpoint or a synthesis. So, of course, that is a hugely influential method, again, down through the centuries.
Huge precursor to Hegel.
Now, as I mentioned previously, unfortunately, some of these guys who were following Socrates around, like Alcibiades, Charmides, and Critias, they are associated with this attempted overthrow of the Athenian democracy. And that is essentially why Socrates is put on trial. So he is found guilty of corrupting the youth. He is executed by taking hemlock, a poison. And that is really the beginning of Plato's own philosophical career, because it's at that point that Plato is disillusioned by the democracy, because he blames the democracy for executing Socrates. And it's really from that point, from about 399, where Plato goes into exile, and he starts putting together the ideas that will eventually appear in the dialogues.
Right, okay, so let's get into Plato then. So we've kind of got the precursor there of what's going on in the background, the philosophical background, the influence of Socrates. So let's get into the man himself. Now, this image I remember having on our ticket when we entered the Vatican, which is still in my wallet.
Yeah, so this is a painting called The School of Athens by Raphael. Of course, the bald guy in the middle is Plato, and then the guy with his hair intact is Aristotle. And of course, it's a great image, because it does symbolise the fundamental conflict between idealism versus materialism, and also between rationalism versus empiricism. So Aristotle rooting philosophy in the world, in the senses, Plato trying to root philosophy in the world beyond the senses. So yeah, that image is a fantastic image. It does encapsulate centuries of philosophical debate. So Plato, again according to the tradition, was a great wrestler. A big fella, big shoulders. And again, that might sound quite trivial, but I think that in some ways what it reflects is that we're going back to Whitehead's Western philosophy's footnotes to Plato. You can basically perch the entire history of Western philosophy on Plato's very broad shoulders. And I think the breadth of his philosophy, I say, covering essentially all the essential areas, that does reflect this, the broadness of his intellectual shoulders, if that's not stretching a point too much. Plato did come from an aristocratic background. He was linked to some hugely important figures in Athenian history. So there's a guy called Solon, who in many ways was the founder of the Athenian democracy back in the 5th century. Plato was part of his family. He's also Critias, who was essentially the leader of the 30 tyrants in the anti-democratic regime. That was Plato's uncle. So you can see how Plato really sort of grew up in an aristocrat, anti-democratic environment. So following the death of Socrates, and in many ways the triumphant restoration of the democracy, you can see why Plato went into exile, because he regarded the restoration of the democracy as actually a step backwards. And looking at Plato's philosophy, when we look at it, although it clearly is a brilliant and a fantastic philosophical construction, Plato was really trying to make a case for a return to the old values of aristocracy, values of oligarchy, the anti-democratic values. So although it is a fantastic construction, its political agenda is essentially arguing for a sort of nostalgic view of the pre-democratic Athens. Plato, interestingly, although a fantastic political philosopher, was apparently a pretty hopeless politician. So he was involved on 2 or 3 occasions as being what we might call a spin doctor. So there was a tyrant on Sicily, a guy called Dionysius II, and Plato had some rather unimpressive attempts to advise Dionysius. He ended up being sold into slavery and held ransom. Pretty disastrous political career. Now, some people might say that just reflects how hopelessly utopian and impractical Plato's ideas were, but I don't think we necessarily need to hold that against him. There's not many great political philosophers who have actually great political careers, so he's not alone there. Following that rather sort of messy involvement in Sicily, Plato returns to Athens around about 387, and he founds what becomes known as the Academy, which in many ways is the world's first university. Now, this lasts right up to around about the 500s AD. It's eventually suppressed by the Roman Empire once it's Christianized. So Plato established this fantastic intellectual and philosophical tradition in Athens. Of course, Athens is the focus, but eventually spreading throughout the Western world, essentially for education for education's sake is really the fundamental principle of Plato's Academy. And of course, the most famous student was Aristotle, going back to the image. So Aristotle, student of Plato, and again in Aristotle's maturity develops really the most important sort of materialist critique of Plato's idealism. And in terms of influence, Aristotle goes on to be the tutor of Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great plays a crucial role through Hellenism of really spreading Greek thinking right across the Western world to where we are today.
So just to finish off then, we'll go through the kind of key periods of Plato's works, and then in the next video we'll go into his key philosophical ideas and concepts. So you've broken it down into 4 periods, so do you want to expand on these?
Yeah, so Plato is a superb systematizer and creator of a great philosophical construction. But again, I think when you study philosophy at university, there's a tendency to think about Plato in a rather monolithic way, as the guy who just came up with this fantastic set of ideas that were all linked together seamlessly. But again, I think we should approach Plato like any other philosopher, look at his philosophical development linked to his own personal and political development. So the first period is really when he was most influenced by Socrates. So if you read these early dialogues, the Apology, the Crito, these are very much based around the trial of Socrates, where the Socratic dialectic is its most obvious. So these dialogues are fantastically readable, almost like play scripts, where you've got characters arguing fundamental ideas, but in a very accessible way. So this first period is really where Plato's most under the influence of Socrates, probably where he was recovering from the emotional impact of the death of Socrates. Then in the second period, you really get the development, the coming together of what becomes his best known philosophical idea, the theory of forms. So we see that in these an early version of that in this second group of dialogues. the Meno, the Gorgias, and the Hippias. Now, again, a lot of these dialogues are named after real historical characters. So all these guys were friends, companions of Socrates who are down in the historical record. So there's no reason to doubt the authenticity of any of this. The third period is really what we might call the mature Plato, where he's really expounding the theory of forms as many people are familiar with it. So the Republic, arguably the greatest work of philosophy even today. Again, fantastically readable, fantastically accessible, some superb imagery and allegories, which we'll come on to later. And that's where the theory of forms is really at its most developed and its most sustained. Now, the fourth period of Socrates, interestingly, is where the rather neglected text really known as the Laws. And this is in many ways where possibly Plato is reflecting on the need for some form of democracy, because, of course, in the Republic, famously, it's ruled by the philosopher kings with negligible democracy. But in the Laws, which obviously written towards the end of his life, he does start to a democratic element starts to seep back in, and maybe that reflects an awareness on Plato's part of the impracticality of the sort of the philosophical dictatorship that is essentially outlined in the Republic. So I think the point of this is we do need to see Plato as not a monolithic thinker, a guy whose philosophy evolved throughout his lifetime through various sort of phases.